From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Mary Rose Flanagan, and I work for the National Endowment for the Arts. We are the sponsor of this pavilion. I am here to introduce Claudia Emerson, the poet. Claudia Emerson is a professor of English and holds the Arrington Distinguished Chair of Poetry at the University of Mary Washington in Frederick, Virginia. Her books of poetry include Pharaoh, Pinion, and Elegy, and her latest is Figure Studies, which came out in 2009. The Late Wife, which is the most autobiographical of her works, won the Pulitzer in 2006. She has served as the Poet Laureate of Virginia from 2008 to 2010. She's received fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Witter Bynner Fellowship from the Library of Congress. But Claudia Emerson wasn't always a poet and professor. She worked as a mail carrier in rural Virginia and managed a used bookstore in Danville, Virginia. The books she handled in those years led her to become serious about writing poetry and returning to school. The themes of her poetry are Keatsian, the fleeting nature of love and beauty. Her poems focus on nature and our habitats and relationships. They take this turn from an anthropological, divorced distance to a magnified, intimate view and then back out again. As with any great poet, the devil is in the details, and she has paid close attention. Unflinching is an overused word for the artist's eye, but it definitely describes the work of this poet. Unflinching and exact. In one of her poems, she describes the work of Joseph Audubon, who painted his birds newly dead. The taxidermied birds, the preserved, were too perfect a lie, so he didn't use those, and the live ones were too resigned or too terrified to use as models. And I quote, "He had to work quickly, often drawing all night before the colors of the eyes and the talons could fade before the advancing rigor." She captures here the fever of an artist working to preserve what they see to share with others, to capture it perfectly. Her exacting eye and dedication puts these unbearably fleeting and beautiful things into words for all of us.
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me all right? That was a wonderful introduction, and you actually brought up some of the things I wanted to talk about since we have been asked today to speak about our becoming writers and what happened in the beginning. And part of my becoming a writer was those long days in a used bookstore in Danville, Virginia, where nobody came in. Pretty much. And it was one of those shops where if you brought in 3 books, you could get 1. And so it was just the lucky thing that some really important books were traded in during that time, things that I had not read when I was younger. One was Rainer Maria Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet. Another was May Sarton's Journal of a Solitude. And those just began to change my life. And then couple those days with the long days on the mail route. I carried Route 4 in Pittsylvania County, Virginia, 86 miles, 3/4 of it gravel road. And that was a great job, I have to say. I used to make more money one day carrying the mail than an entire week in the bookstore. So it was a crazy life, but right around that time, also a series came on PBS called Voices and Visions. Anybody remember that? And they did little documentaries about poets that I had read when I was younger, but frankly hadn't appreciated. So I began to return to Emily Dickinson, Robert Frost, William Carlos Williams, with a very different, more mature eye, and also a greater depression, which helped a whole lot. Anyway, the part of my narrative of becoming a poet I wasn't going to tell, but I just decided, well, I'll just tell it. I lived in rural Virginia, Pittsylvania County, in a rented farmhouse with my ex-husband and the harmonic convergence happened. Does anybody remember that from the 80s? And I don't even remember exactly what we were supposed to do, but we went out with some neighbors and stood in an open field, and the stars were shining, and we all sort of hummed and ummed and stuff like that. And right after that, I started writing like a house on fire. Within 2 years, I was in graduate school. So to be fair to the heavens, there was a role there. I wanted to read a couple examples from my third book. That is up to date, the most personal of the books. For a long time in my poetry, I might use the first person, but I hid a lot in it. And I think, honestly, it was a desire not to write anything so personal, but it was also, frankly, being in a mostly unhappy marriage and not able to talk about it. So the characters I chose were often pretty repressed figures, older women who were miserable, a milk cow. I mean, just all these various voices that appeal to me for now what seem much clearer reasons. But I did end up moving to Fredericksburg. I got divorced during that time and remarried my husband, Kent, who's right here on the front row. In Fredericksburg, we call him the Bearded Muse. And so I wrote the book Late Wife in the form of letters for the most part. The first section are in my voice as well as I know myself, addressing my ex-husband. This one opens the sequence. It's called Aftermath. I think by now it is time for the second cutting. I imagine the field, the one above the last house we rented, has lain in convalescence long enough. The hawk has taken back the air above new grass, and the doe again can hide her young. I can tell you now I crossed that field weeks before the first pass of the blade, through grass and briars, fog, the night itself to my thighs, my skirt pulled up that high. I came to what had been our house and stood outside. I saw her in it. She reminded me of me, with her hair black and long, as mine had been, as she moved in and then away from the sharp frame the window made of the darkness. I confess that last house was the coldest I kept. In it, I became formless as fog crossing the walls, formless as your breath as it rose from your mouth to disappear in the air above you. You see, aftermath is easier, opening again the wound along its numb scar. It is the sentence, spoken the second time, truer, perhaps, with the blunt edge of a practiced tongue. My ex-husband and I lived in 5 old farmhouses. The plan was always we'd see some place that didn't have anybody living in it, and so we would offer to fix it up in exchange for rent. So sometimes I confuse them in the poems because I literally won't remember which house was which. But this one happened that in the last house we rented. And it's the only one in the sequence that happens in the summertime. I realized after I wrote the divorce poems that they were all set in the dead of winter with those awful wood stoves and mud and stuff like that. But as I've said many times, this one happens in summer, but it's not any cheerier than the ones in winter. Pitching horseshoes. Some of your buddies might come around for a couple of beers and a game, but most evenings you pitched horseshoes alone. I washed up the dishes or watered the garden to the thudding sound of the horseshoe in the pit, or the practiced ring of metal against metal after the silent arc end over end. That last summer, you played a seamless, unscored game against yourself, or night falling, or coming in the house. You were good at it. From the porch, I watched you become shadowless, then featureless, until I knew you couldn't see either, and still the dusk rang out, your aim that easy. Between the iron stakes you had driven into the hard earth yourself, you paced back and forth, as if there were a decision to make, and you were the one to make it. While the story of getting divorced is a sad one, it's also sadly completely ordinary. And I wasn't sure I'd ever write about the experience since nothing really traumatic had happened except the passage of time and feeling that this wasn't really going anywhere. But when I met Kent, I saw things differently from his point of view, since his wife, he'd been very happily married, and his wife had died from lung cancer. And so it was a happy re-beginning for both of us, but I always felt kind of guilty for getting to be happy again for that reason. And when you're wired to write, you just do it, and you're not sure if they're going to be for any sort of public thing or not. Maybe they'll just go into the drawer. But it was the first time, I think Linda Paston, who's here, was in her reading talking about when we have students say to us, well, this really happened, and we have to say as teachers, well, I don't care what really happened. Your loyalty is to the art and to the poem and not to the experience. I had the strangest thing, though, when I was writing just these poems, just these 14 poems, where I wouldn't allow myself any liberties with the what happened as I saw it. If I couldn't write it and make it good, I wasn't going to do it for whatever reason. I don't know. Just this internal ethical policeman came on the scene. But these are also, in my voice, addressing Kent. This one is called The Cough. You can't recall when it first appeared in her, but it must have been in late summer, around the time the locusts came and muted crickets, birds' song, the wind. And in the same way you would not have perceived a tightening in the trees before the onslaught of that sound, you noticed nothing before it. Fatigue, perhaps, intolerance for the heat. She kept saying then that it would pass with the season, insisted, even as it consumed her, grew bolder, not sleeping even when she slept. It would outlive the locusts, but by days few enough to count, the translucent forms still left clinging to the world they had overset, each one a perfect mold of the body that refused it. The X-rays. By the time they saw what they were looking at, it was already risen into the bones of her chest. They could show you then the lungs were white with it. They said it was like salt in water, that hard to see as separate and would be that hard to remove, like moonlight dissolved in fog in the dense web of vessels. You say now you kept them longer than you should have, those shadow photographs of the closed room of her body, while you wandered around inside yourself as though inside another room she had abandoned to her absence, to barren light and air, the one indistinguishable from the other. Kent is a wonderful musician, multi-instrumentalist, and he also collects a lot of acoustic instruments. Although he did, for my 54th birthday, gave me a Fender Telecaster, so we have some electric going on down in the basement. But the ones we have upstairs are all acoustic. And one day I said to him, gosh, you sure own a lot of instruments. And he said a very smart thing, which was no one owns a musical instrument. They're just guests. So I took that idea for this poem. Stringed instrument collection. You began it the third fall you were alone, and soon they surrounded you, mandolins, mandolas, guitars, cutaways, dreadnoughts, the upright bass. You spent most of those nights with the jazz guitar, learning Birdland and Twilight Time. The others hung from inlaid necks, scrolled heads, patient, mute, the way they hang now from these walls. You claim no wood is ever dead, even if it's gone to fire and risen as heat, and think of them not as possessions, but as guests who will survive you, pass to other hands the way they passed to yours. Sometimes a name called out, a cough, a laugh will echo here, our voices in the hollows of their bodies, for now sustained. After I finished the Late Wife book, well, I tend to think in terms of whole book projects. A lot of us will do it this way, but I really didn't want to write in the first person anymore for a while. I wanted to leave that alone and do something not so, frankly, painful for some of it. So I decided to look back into some old notes I had that I'd been dragging around from my brief stint, 2-year stint, being the dean of a girls' boarding school in my hometown of Chatham, Virginia. Was anybody here for the Jonathan Yardley talk earlier today? It was so interesting to hear him talk about Chatham, Virginia, where he spent some of his boyhood. His father was the headmaster of the girls' school that I ended up attending as a villager, since I was from the town. So I just, the whole time I was the dean, I wasn't writing very much, because when you're the dean of a girls' boarding school, they don't ever go home, and so you don't either. And they're always getting into trouble, and you're responsible for everything. And I'll never forget the night I was trying to look through the physician's desk reference about something some girl had taken, and I thought, I have an MFA in poetry. This is not going well. So, but anyway, the entire time I was there, I just took notes, because I thought maybe I can do something with this someday. And so I ended up writing a 25 poem lyric sequence looking at the girls in a variety of ways. Because it always bothered me at a school that claimed they were training us to be leaders, that every position of leadership in the school was held by a man, when I was there anyway. And you just were taught, you were trained to be good. And being good is good, but you never learn to voice dissent very well when you're good for too long, right? How could I resist then writing one called Headmaster? He rocks up onto the balls of his feet, clears his throat to lead the assembly with a voice more familiar than their fathers, brothers, those distant as only kin can be. The girls surround him, the youngest sitting on the floor, close enough to notice in his loafers the clean, empty slits where the pennies are supposed to go. I have to say, I'd never had just flat out fun writing poetry until I started doing these, because I got to be kind of wicked, and I had never gotten to be wicked before. But some of my classmates from Chatham Hall didn't appreciate it, and I got a really angry email from my roommate who said that I wouldn't be anywhere without that school, and how could I write these mean little poems about our school? What they are missing. The local boys are, of course, forbidden. This leaves only the rare visiting father, awkward brother, the headmaster, the boy who bush hogs the pasture, or the chaplain in his telling collar, starched tooth at the throat to remind them. I love to find good lessons that would turn into poems. This one was actually inspired by teaching a class at the University of Mary Washington some years ago that was the only class in the humanities that carried the environmental awareness designation. And so I was really proud of that. But I can't remember how I came upon it, but learning about the right whale. And so I decided to turn it into a lesson for the girls. Environmental awareness, the right whale. The whale was known as right because it was magnificent with oil, slow and easy to find and slaughter, floating even when dead. But after it was no longer needed for fat, men still hunted the whale for its rich mouth of baleen, harvested for hair brushes, buggy whips, umbrella ribs, the stays of corsets, vain things designed to mold the female body. Sculpt a waist so small a man's hands could meet with ease around it. Crazy, the girls agree, the way those women bought it. History lesson. They have been half listening to a lecture on the Great Depression when the teacher looks up, begins to talk about the president and trout fishing, a digression he admits that will not be on the test. Hoover would catch too many trout to eat, and so had a small cement pool constructed. He'd keep the fish for days, while he calmly read at the edge of the water, absent-mindedly hand-feeding them beef hearts brought in from Washington as though to tame them. Later, the girls can think of nothing else, circling the goldfish pond, throwing bits of a dinner roll onto the surface, the fish rising to them through water so still their slow refusal to school is its only motion. I couldn't help, when I was the dean of the girls' school, we had to have ceaseless, endless rounds of fire drills and things like that. So that inspired this poem. But the real story of a scare we had when I was the dean, we had a building project going on, and the crew hit a gas line, and I panicked and decided to evacuate the entire school. So I did this and rang the bells and lined all the girls out front and waited for the volunteer fire department guys to come. And as it turns out, we had the old clapper bells that rang, you know, and although the volunteer fire department, they're friends and cousins and things like this, and maybe they were just giving me grief, but they said if the leak had been bad enough, it could have sparked an explosion with the bells, and I would have blown up the entire place, and then I would have killed all the girls because I had lined them up too close to the school. So it was even a greater sign that I needed to move on to some other line of work. But it was fun to think of writing a poem where that doesn't happen. Fire drill. Bells sound them from sleep, and their imaginations rise, recite all they have been told, the curtains on fire, the beds, nightgowns, their hair, their hair. They've practiced this escape before, and know to close the windows last, descend the ringing flights of stairs in perfect wordlessness, to line up, barefoot, on the dew-wet lawn, face the building, pretend to watch it burn. This one ends the girl sequence. I thought I would read this one and then talk a little bit about the transition to a newer project. But anyway, this reunion weekend poem is the one that made my college roommate so mad at me. Reunion weekend. 30 years later, drunk on red wine, they will return to wander the hall, searching for a certain room, its windows still memorized, will delight in finding through familiar panes the moon rising just the way it had when they'd lain sleepless beneath it. But they cannot return to the twin bed, long assigned, reassigned to some other possibility, sick for home. Another disappointment. The room itself practicing what they will have come to prove cannot be finished. I have a new book coming out in January, so this one isn't here, so it's probably dumb to read work when you can't go buy the book, but that's okay. I thought it's important to say that as much as I thought I really loved writing in the third person and doing something objective and more fun, but life sort of gets in the way of that, and during the writing of the figure studies book, I lost half my immediate family, my only brother to cancer when he was way too young, and my father died from old age. And so those two things happened, jammed up very close together. So I resisted it for a while and then succumbed. So here's one of the poems that deals with my brother's death. It involves, though, I don't know if everybody's here in the city, but if your refrigerator at Christmas time, your refrigerator won't hold it all, so you would designate a room in the house and turn off the heat so you could put all the extra food in there. So my brother's room, he lived in the Ozarks in Missouri. He wasn't going to come home anymore, well or not, and my mother had turned my brother's room into the cold room. Her refrigerator full, my mother has stored some things in the cold of my brother's closed-off room. Christmas oranges and pears on the floor, the salt-cured ham that hung for a full year from the cellar rafters, cooked now and kept on the chest of drawers. He is far away and ill. She knows he will not come home, suspects she will not see or hold him again in the flesh, allowed him only in smiling photographs, undone by a voice thin on the phone. Afternoons, she climbs the slow, complaining stairs with a platter and carving knife. She wears her winter coat, opens the door to his bed still made, stale light, the scent of ripe fruit and cold smoke. Here, in the room let go for this, she concentrates on carving the meat, so even and thin she can see through it to the blade, its clean, practiced passage. Just so, she says, as though to no one, just so. As my brother actually passed away before my father did, when my father was so elderly and housebound, I don't know, the two things seemed very far apart in some ways to us. And my father refused to talk about it, ever. This one is called the present tense, and it involves a time when I was sitting with my father. The poem will tell you this, but I was stunned always to try to get something from the other old father I had known, who was no longer there. But one day he just wasn't talking a lot, and I asked him if he was thinking about something, if there was something he was remembering. And he said, I'm remembering Claudia, which was just one of those weird things of, it's the present tense, but to him he was registering a memory. There will be a worse day. He will live long enough not to know me at all, and the turn toward it begun this hour with recognition has slowed to a measureless stare. Worse than the wordless pauses common now, he concentrates on me, direct and quiet, the way light concentrates, falling through a window to the floor. I hold his gaze until I am considering the surface of his eyes the way I might the dulling surface of a pond, drought-shrunken, clouded over with dust and pollen. But there is light enough to see my face, mirrored weakly, small, infant in the pupils, as though from some great distance. Finally, I ask him what he is thinking about, or if he is remembering something he'd like to tell me, and at last he nods, saying yes, he is remembering his daughter, naming me in the third person, as though I am not the one asking, as though I am the one not dying, but already mourned, and he has survived me long enough to find solace in a memory. And I, as I have always known myself, am fallen away then from the present tense into reminiscence, the lucid was. Catfish. It nuzzles oblivion, confuses itself with mud. A creature of familiar taste, it ambushes from its nest of ooze the pond's brighter fish, clears its palate with their eggs, lumbers fat and stagnant into winter, lulled into dreams of light, sinking until light drowns, and all is as before. I know I'm supposed to leave time for questions, so I think I'll give you the one that currently closes this book. And it really doesn't make sense in some ways without the other poems before it, but I think you get a sense of it. Although I did become obsessed with researching flocking theory, which I blabbed about all the time to my students and to even my English department at Mary Washington. As a matter of fact, I made us start proposing ideas and voting according to swarm theory that I read about in the National Geographic. And when they said, why should we do this? I won't give you all the details of what this means, but why should we do this? And I said, we'll be happier. And so they voted to do it. So anyway, it was a good trick I played on them. So, flocking theory. At dusk each winter evening in the half hour before they must relinquish sky to night, starlings quicken, flock in forms, symmetries shifting, the likenesses so fast and fluid I can't hold on to anyone, before it dissolves into another. And I have taught myself to accept the seamless recreations not as uneasy whimsy, but as the musings of a lucid soul or the disclosures of God, the wind itself made seen, the shade a shadow casts. No one knows for certain what controls this, the flocked moving by space, measured and kept strict distances between the bodies. But the birds, I like to think, are having none of theory anyway, whatever it may be, none of me, abandoning themselves instead to the invariable bliss of what is, the fact of flying manifest in every changing figure, one enormous wing, a waterfall of bees, a murmurous curtain falling to rise as smoke, a funnel cloud, helix, an arm, its empty sleep. Thank you. Anyone have a question for me? No? Just want to say then another thanks to the National Endowment for the Arts. Part of the library is great, but I had an NEA fellowship pretty early on in my career, and this is one of the greatest things that ever happened to me in terms of the book that came from that experience. So I always like to give a shout out for the National Endowment for the, oh, here, I've got a question. I'll stop talking.
Anyway, okay. So I would like to hear your advice or the case either for or against an aspiring poets obtaining an MFA in poetry.
Okay. A couple of things. I can speak from my own experience and then maybe talk about some of my thinking about the advice I give my own students now. I went to get a Master of Fine Arts degree when I was in my early 30s, which I thought was really old then. And I went to the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, which is an old traditional studio writing program. And I really didn't know anything about other writing programs. I was married to someone. That was the closest one I could drive to it. I managed to get in, even though I'd been out of school for 10 years and couldn't find a professor who remembered me. And it absolutely changed my life. It saved me a lot of time. I was there at a good time. I worked with Robert Watson and Alan Shapiro and Fred Chappell, everything. Tom Kirby Smith taught me a graduate prosody course that changed my life because part of what I didn't talk about in my background, I had wanted, if I thought about writing, it was to be a fiction writer. So I had some catching up to do in terms of the writing of poetry, and I loved it. And I wrote what basically, years later, but the core of it was my thesis. So, but it's not a professional degree in terms of I'm going to go be a professor if I get this degree. It's to help you become a better writer at its core. And if you can do a good one and work with good people and not break the bank to get it, I recommend it wholeheartedly. So I tell my students, learn how to be a welder too. Do something that can be electrician, right? You know, something that, oh, I've got 10 minutes, okay. But yeah, we can talk more after too, but I have a lot more to say about it. But, yes, ma'am.
I was wondering if you could talk more about the transition between writing in the third person and writing about more personal stuff. I'm an MFA, and I kind of write really I don't like writing about myself.
Yeah, I didn't either.
So I just wanted to hear more about
It's
that.
very scary, and most people are more comfortable with it or seem to be, but for me to go from things that weren't personal or not overtly personal to the very personal is a lot riskier when people say mean things about it, because I call it writing close to the bone. I don't think I made that up, but I think it is harder to do it and do it well. But I certainly love to read other people's experiences and their more autobiographical things. I've always been drawn to it, but the other thing, I just didn't think I had much of a story that was interesting until I married Kent, and I just had this outpouring of emotion about what he had been through. So, but that's why I chose a really constrained form to do it in. I chose sonnet variations because it kept me, again, just in a greater, intense place of control. You can always write about yourself in third person too. That's okay. Yeah.
A question over here. So I found for myself that there's sort of, this disjoint, the creative flow of sort of writing something the first time, which, is, a very, internal process, whereas like going back and trying to, revise and correct feels a lot more left brain and less creative. I'm, curious what your experience is with, dealing with that tension and, what, describe, what are the parts that go for you in writing a poem?
Yeah. It's a long process for me, and I know what you're saying about in the beginning it's one thing and then it turns into something else, and when the work begins to talk back to you in some ways that you didn't expect it would, or you don't, we were talking about that, or you don't appreciate it. I have a couple tricks that I do. One is, and I force this on my poor students who are out here too, have somebody read something back to you in another voice, not somebody you necessarily know too well, so you can hear the work disembodied, and sometimes then you can revise it better. The other thing is just don't, I don't know how, if you write or type, but in revision, don't just move things around. It gets to a point where you're typing the entire thing over. Can you tell I'm a little OCD? It's like, it doesn't bother me at all, just to start over from the beginning and make sure you still mean those early drafts. The other thing, sometimes if you're stalled, leave it alone, but be careful not to abandon something too soon. Because I've found it difficult in terms of that distancing, that left brain thing. Sometimes if I've left the poem alone too long, it'll get stale and I've lost the place I was when it was fresh to me. I don't know if that helps. But
that's great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Oh, yes, sir.
Hi. Yeah, could you talk about geography, how it impacts your work? Because you kind of started as a rural place and now you're kind of in a suburb. Did that impact you?
Oh yeah, he's talking about the impact of my physical geography on the poems. It's really great. And I've been a little sad sometimes to see myself go from what defined the earlier work, which was a lot of rural landscape, and I love ruined places and stuff like that, and I don't see it too much anymore. I live in Fredericksburg, I live in the city, and I can see the work go to interiors. The river appears, and there are some things like that, or when we go hiking, there's some things that come out of that. But I've lost some of that original inspiration, because I'm very influenced by it. I'm also very influenced by just even the weather. If I grade one set of papers on a rainy day and one set on a sunny day, the rainy day grades are worse. It's that bad. But I've been kind of sad about it to see that change. And yet there's something to be said for this is just my reality, and those interiors are more where I am. Although in the Secure the Shadow book, to return to writing about my brother and father, my mother still lives in Chatham, Virginia, so I go there about once a month, and I made a return to some of those landscapes in that book. But it's a lot more memory driven now because I don't live in those houses. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, thank you all very much. I really enjoyed it.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.